Hello everyone, this is Ali, and welcome to my World of Warcraft Versus channel, dedicated to the analysis of potential duels between major characters from the Warcraft lore. In each of these videos, I'll be reviewing their strengths and weaknesses, and describing how I think the battle would go, as well as who would emerge victorious. Most of the time, these battles may be interpreted in tons of different ways, with tons of different outcomes. So, the following represents my own opinion only, and I'll be happy to discuss your theories and points of view about them in the comments. Please note, however, that these videos rely on the lore concerning each character, and the gameplay aspects of the Warcraft franchise won't be taken into account, aside from the information it may provide about the lore. Since English is not my native language, forgive my possible mistakes, and don't hesitate to correct me in the comments. The first of these battles will concern Vol'jin and Zul'jin, the most notorious troll warlords of Azeroth. Both are great combatants and deeply connected with dark and subtle sources of power. But the most interesting aspect, in my opinion, is their resilience, their tenacity, and ability to overcome their enemies and survive despite whatever odds and numbers are against them. To make the battles as interesting as possible, both of them will be considered as they were in their prime, which for both of them was right before their deaths. For the fans, this is an occasion to remember Vol'jin and his life, as he was recently slain in battle by the Burning Legion during the Legion expansion pre-patch.
The drums of war thunder once again.
Vol'jin was an adult troll male, born on the Darkspear Isles from his father Zal'in, the previous chieftain of the Darkspear tribe, and was raised there as a powerful shadow hunter, succeeding his father as chieftain, before becoming the first non-orc to attain the position of war chief of the Horde, after his rebellion against the tyranny of Garrosh Hellscream. Vol'jin was trained in mystical hunting at the Darkspear Isles with his best friend Zal'in, and was already a capable warrior, gifted and heard by the lords. After he returned from a very strenuous trial in the jungle, Vol'jin and Zal'in found the village slaughtered by the forces of the Nagas, who had sacrificed Vol'jin's father and chieftain of the tribe, Sinjin. Saved from the brink of destruction by the orcish horde of warchief Thrall, Vol'jin took the leadership of his tribe and swore fealty to the horde, accompanying it across the Great Seas to eventually settle into the Echo Isles and the land of Durotar, helping protect it from the assaults of Dale and Proudmoore. Once there, Vol'jin took up residence in Orgrimmar, where he advised Thrall and tried to protect what remained of his people in Sinjin village, plagued by the assaults of their former friend Zal'in, gone mad with power. Years later, after notably pushing for the defeat of the Gurubashi and helping Thrall retake the Undercity and protect it from the Alliance, Vol'jin eventually defeated Zal'in, fully retaking the Echo Isles, only to be harassed by a far more dangerous foe, the new war chief of the Horde, Garrosh Hellscream. Vol'jin initially complied with Garrosh's violent rule, even choosing to remain in the Horde despite the rise of the Zendalari, but never hid his criticism of Hellscream's methods, even voicing death threats against the ruthless war chief. The two became increasingly alienated, and after the bombing of Pheromore, Garrosh went one step further into dictatorship after his landfall in Pandaria, by sending assassins against Vol'jin and driving the Darkspear trolls out of Orgrimmar. The troll chieftain barely survived and fled into the wilderness. On the brink of death, he was visited by a vision of the Lower of Death, Bronson D, and the ghost of his father Sinjin, and ended up being brought to the Shadowpan Monastery by Chainstone Stout, where he was nursed back to health. Vol'jin's stay at the monastery and discovery of the Pandaren philosophy greatly influenced his outlook on his own life, as he learned monk techniques and befriended a human, Terathan Court. The both of them pushed back a powerful Zendalari invasion force, defending Pandaria, and Vol'jin eventually returned to Durotar, where he organized and led the massive rebellion against Garrosh alongside other Horde leaders. The whole rebellion and the alliance eventually overthrew her scream, and Thrall bestowed the title of war chief upon a reluctant Vol'jin for his heroic deeds. After Garrosh escaped into the past and unleashed the Iron Horde, Vol'jin coordinated the Horde's retaliation into Draenor. However, his reign was short-lived. The escape of the alternate Gul'dan to Azeroth allowed the Warlock to open a portal of invasion for the Burning Legion, and the attack Vol'jin led on the disastrous Battle of the Broken Shore saw him leave the battlefield with a heavy, poisoned wound, saved by Sylvanas Windrunner. This wound was eventually the death of him, and his body was cremated on a funeral pyre before the eyes of the entire Horde. Zul'jin was an aged troll male, born in the city of Zul'aman prior to the First War, in the Amani mountain range near Quel'Thalas, who eventually became a powerful witch doctor and the most famous leader of the Amani tribe in its war against the Alliance and the Elven Kingdom of Silvermoon, striving his entire life to restore the Amani Empire to its former glory and avenge the blood feud against the High Elves. Rising early in his life at the top of the various Amani tribes, after defeating all their leaders to force them to unite, Zul'jin became the new spearhead for the Forest Trolls' ancient war against the Elves and Humans, and a legend to many troll ears. When the Orcish horde of War Chief Orgrim Doomhammer sailed north in its large-scale conquest of the human kingdoms, Zul'jin was approached by the Orcs and reluctantly joined the horde, with a promise that by the end of the Second War, the lands and forests of Quel'Thalas will go to the Amanis. Although this was the point where Zul'jin got the closest to actually getting his revenge, the defeat of the Horde left him alone and surrounded by his most bitter enemies. He was eventually captured by High Elves Rangers, who tortured him to avenge their fallen comrades. During his captivity, Zul'jin's eye was brutally removed, and his plight deprived him of the benediction of the Lords, along with his natural regeneration abilities. The Troll Warlord eventually escaped by severing his own arm, and fled into the wilderness, crippled, bitter, and abandoned, although many among the Troll tribes chanted his name and vowed to avenge him. Consumed with rage, he secretly returned to Zul'aman, slowly gathering his army, striking deals with dark powers and planning to get revenge upon Silvermoon. But when the newly christened Blood Elves joined the Horde, his disgust for his former allies was so bitter that Zul'jin, backed by the animal gods of the Amanis, immediately began his campaign against the Cinderai and anyone among the Horde and the Alliance who would assist them. However, this proved to be too much for the old troll and his tribe to handle, as Zul'aman was invaded by both factions and Zul'jin slain at its heart after putting up a bitter fight. Vol'jin and Zul'jin are both the most famous troll characters of the lore and personal favorites of mine. They were both resourceful, cunning, and very intelligent, both very stubborn in their own ways, and their reputations as well deserved in both cases. The dynamic is made particularly interesting in that they are both what the other could have been had things gone a different path, and their powers and upbringings are very similar yet quite distinct, which I hope will lead up to an interesting fight. Every aspect of their strengths and weaknesses will now be analyzed, so that we can better imagine who would win in a fight to the death, something that could have happened when they were indirect enemies during Zul'jin's last stand in Zul'aman.
My child, I watched with pride as you grew into a weapon of righteousness.
At the time of his death, Vol'jin was a powerful jungle troll in his prime, especially blessed by the Lords. As an accomplished shadow hunter, Vol'jin had gone through extensive training into hunting, fighting, and though he wasn't made to be a warrior, he was fit largely enough to be one. His elongated muscles gave him excellent reach, speed, agility, and endurance, making him, like most jungle trolls, a supple combatant rather than a physically powerful one. Although the attempt on his life left him gravely injured, and he had showed his throat scarred the wrong way to give himself a rough voice, Vol'jin fully recovered, being left with an all-around excellent physique, capable of fighting and running for hours on end. His monk training in Pandaria did nothing to weaken him, leaving him, on certain occasions, capable to kill an opponent in a single willing punch. At the time of his death, Zul'jin was an old yet extremely strong Amani warrior, capable of fighting an entire raid of enemies despite missing an arm and an eye, along with his lower base regeneration ability. Fighting without armor throughout the entire Second War, Zul'jin proved himself to be an all-around perfect fighter, honoring both the muscle strength and endurance of the forest trolls, and being capable of competing with the best elven rangers in terms of speed and agility. His resistance to pain and refusal to give up are legendary, and the blessings of the animal gods of Zul'jin have only made him better and stronger, even in his ordinary state. Despite all this, his age and missing organs must still be taken into account to measure his physical state. This one is a tough choice. The overall capability of Zul'jin makes him physically exceed Vol'jin, especially if you consider that as a straight-up warrior and an axe thrower, Zul'jin was much more physically oriented than his shadow hunter opponent. Even in his old age, his physical traits are clearly superior faced with Vol'jin, despite the latter's excellence. This being noted, Zul'jin's abilities have to be sorely affected by his missing arm and eye, largely diminishing his prowess in battle. Finally, being cut off from the law's benediction leaves him unable to regenerate and be supported by the might of the spirits, whereas Vol'jin is constantly under their care, maybe more so than many of the trolls. For all these advantages and despite Zul'jin's superior build, I give the physical edge to Vol'jin of the Darkspear.
Fight! Kill! Salute!
Vol'jin was a shadow hunter, trying to be the best troll society has to offer in both physical and spiritual domains, and as such, he has been more than trained to fight. Able to wield blade, spear, glaive and bow both into hunting and into war, the Darkspear chieftain can carry a heavy load of weaponry without ever being slowed down or hampered in his movements, and is able to shift between weapons at great speed without stopping. Even in his beginnings, he was a fearsome opponent, but his trials in Pandaria further upgraded his abilities. After his training in Shadowpan Monastery, Vol'jin was able to repel a Zendalari assault almost by himself by dancing around the battlefield with his bow and slicing through his opponents. Among other things, his monk training taught him deadly precision in the application of physical force, and despite a strength not above that of many others, he has demonstrated the ability to deal devastating unarmed blows, which very few can withstand without suffering heavy or even fatal damage. Zul'jin was an axe thrower during the Second War, and throughout his abilities he can be considered both as a warrior or a rogue, especially embodying the talents of an outlaw rogue. With very little armor and weaponry, a lack of which may be due to the impoverishment of the Amani tribe, he was able to cleave through any battlefield, leaving a trail of bodies behind him. With a relative throwing ability, Zul'jin was capable of ranged fighting, although his greatest prowess clearly came in hand-to-hand combat. Able to fight off an entire raid by himself, Zul'jin's grievous throw ability in particular allows him to inflict deadly wounds, slowly leading his opponents to their demise. Of the two contestants, It was clear from the beginning that Zul'jin was the most battle-oriented, and it seems clear to me that he would have the advantage over Vol'jin in a straight-up clash of weapons. His enemy would give him trouble, with an excellent and unusual training, coupled with a large and versatile array of weapons. But ultimately, Zul'jin's speed would catch up to the youngest troll, and there would be little he could do to survive such a fight against one that may be the greatest snow troll fighter of the lore. Battle capability edge goes to Zul'jin of the Amani.
Halt, lad. There's an inscription on the dais. It's a warning. It says, "Whomsoever takes up this blade shall wield power eternal. Just as the blade rends flesh, so must power scar the spirit."
Vol'jin's weapons and armor have been inconsistently depicted throughout the years, and he has been shown to own a large array of different weapons and armor types. First shown as a classic witch doctor in Warcraft 3, we know from the lore that he already owned a bow and various hunting knives and spears, with the training that came with it. An item called Darkspear does exist in the World of Warcraft database, but it isn't clear whether or not it actually exists in the story, and Vol'jin has never been associated with it. During the first years of World of Warcraft, Vol'jin had a simple look, wearing mail armor and troll pauldrons, and displaying for the first time the classic double-bladed glaive used by the Shadow Hunters. During the retaking of the Echo Isles, Vol'jin wore far more heavy armor, along with a voodoo mask, and proved proficient with his bow and blade by defeating his father's murderer, the Nagasi witch Zorjira, early after the Cataclysm. When his time as Garrus' foil came, Vol'jin was depicted with light wooden witch doctor gear, providing him with the means of carrying everything he needed, some protection, and the same speed and maneuverability as if he was naked. From his beginnings, he is described as riding a red raptor into his hunts and battles, like many other Darkspear trolls. Not much is known about Zul'jin's equipment, but it can be observed from his Warcraft 2 artwork and World of Warcraft model that he wears extremely light armor, basically nothing, and has consistently been seen wearing a very large scarf, covering his entire jaw and chest. In Warcraft 2, he uses ordinary throwing axes like the rest of the game's troll units, serving as a foil to the Alliance's Havan archers. With the coming of the Burning Crusade and the release of the Gods of Zul'jin patch, Zul'jin was reintroduced with a simple dagger in his remaining hand, but is represented as using a much more complex blade in the artworks, strapped to his arm like an extension of it, and adorned in trollish runes. Since Burning Crusade, Amani trolls have been depicted as using bears for their mounts, and although Zul'jin was never seen riding one, it's likely he knows how to do it and has access to one. With a much larger number of weapons, armors, and amount he seems to be used to ride in combat, it appears quite clearly that Vol'jin wins the equipment round. This, however, should not be considered a mistake of Zul'jin's part, as it's likely his choices of weaponry are meant to leave him with a maximum amount of speed, and his throwing abilities make him more than capable of taking on much more heavily equipped foes. Still, the equipment edge is won by Vol'jin of the Darkspear.
All my life I have lived by the sword. I've seen kingdoms burn, and watched brave heroes die in vain.
Starting to lead his people at a relatively young age, Vol'jin received much of his early experience and tactical training from the hunting grounds of the Darkspear Isles and his Shadow Hunter teachings. Although he struggled to save his own tribe from Zorjira and Zal'in, he followed the Darkspear philosophy of enduring, striving to survive and stand strong first, rather than die consumed with bloodlust. These principles paid off, as he eventually reclaimed the Echo Isles, and we can see from the counsel he gives Thrall and the world that Vol'jin became a wise leader early on, as well as a smart one. Despite the great tactical advantages and boons he could have received from allying with the Zandalari, which he had many occasions to do and refused every time, even when proposed with marriage in place of prominence in the Troll Empire, Vol'jin always remained true to his pledge to the Horde, both because of his loyalty to the Hawks and because he is capable of bonding and understanding the value of shared pains and triumphs, making him one of the staunchest allies of the Orcs and Taurens of Kalimdor. His rebellion against Garrosh's tyranny, coupled with learning to receive the help of Pandarans and even humans, indicates that Vol'jin is both a ruthless tactician, capable of destroying his opponents without doubting himself for even a second, and yet sees the value of patience, compromise and retreat when needed, always thinking about the long game, and how his actions reflect upon his honor in the eyes of the Loas and his people. Zul'jin has spent his entire life fighting against elves and humans, in a war that started long before his birth and kept going on after his death. Despite being outnumbered and desperate for the entirety of his struggles, even being maimed and tortured on one occasion, he never faltered in any way, and always demonstrated ruthless determination against his foes, often reigniting the conflict where he would have had an occasion to strike a useful period of peace. Furthermore, he is extremely reluctant to accept exterior help, initially refusing Doomhammer's offer against the Alliance, accepting his help only after being saved by Orcs against the promise of power of a Quel'Thalas. He abandoned the Horde immediately after the Second War, and never rejoined it afterwards, even when he was approached by Orgrimmar diplomats. Despite this refusal, he considers his former allies to be traitors for recruiting the Blooders into their midst, and immediately hated them as much as he hates almost the entire world. Zul'jin is extremely experienced and cunning, especially capable when he is fighting alone, even against a large number of enemies, but doesn't know when to give up a fight, making him likely to choose death over defeat or retreat. This warrior mindset of his ends up being a double-edged sword for him, responsible for both his greatest successes and failures. Both warlords are extremely capable tacticians, both in and out of battlefield, while Zul'jin's guerrilla accomplishments take the cake. While Vol'jin possesses a greater set in the wisdom and spiritual guidance that Zul'jin lacks, and the dire circumstances they faced was comparable, the Amani chieftain never escaped combat and kept fighting like a madman, behavior that would have quickly brought Vol'jin and his tribe to ruins, and that Zul'jin survived on sheer account of his tactical genius is a testimony to how smart he is. Furthermore, Zul'jin is older than his opponent, and has had much more experience in combat. The battle experience edge goes, in the end, to Zul'jin of the Amani.
In secret, I began harvesting what energies I could. I had a brief taste of true power.
Vol'jin was raised by his father San'jin, a powerful witch doctor, to become a shadow hunter, the likes of which used to rule troll civilization. Shadow hunters, a notorious class in the lore, are quite hard to sum up and understand. While they are closest to shadow priests, they are more than capable of wielding a warrior's strength, a rogue's speed or a hunter's cunning, and use totems to protect themselves and their allies. They can be considered a mix of all classes originally available to trolls, and you may sum them up as voodoo warrior priests straddling between the light and dark, attempting to stay in control for the benefit of their tribe or themselves, depending on their personalities. They are mostly notable for their ability to heal themselves, cast various curses on their enemies. Shadow hunters bind their souls to the lower spirits, receiving gifts of speed, strength, healing, lightnings and curses, but Vol'jin in particular seems to have a connection with the traditional lore of the Darkspear tribe, Bronze-Samedi, a protector of the dead with considerable hatred for the abomination of undeath. Despite being likely to have healing spells at his disposal, they are never shown, and it tends to fend off Alliance raiders with mostly hexes and shadow spells. This being said, Vol'jin's deep connection to the lore grants him a heightened and supernatural regeneration ability, and his training at the Shadowpan Monastery taught him how to control his own energy in the most effective ways. Given his past achievements, Vol'jin can be considered one of the most skillful and powerful shadow hunters of Azeroth. For the most part of his life, Zul'jin was a straight-up combatant, battling his foes with only exterior magical help from the witch doctors of his tribe. However, with his return to Zul'in, he agreed to trade with the dark powers ruling over witch doctor Malakras, and let himself be imbued and blessed by the liberated animal gods of Zul'in. During his last stand, Zul'jin had gained access to various animal transformations, his abilities looking like that of a druid. His bear form allowed him a far greater resistance to damage and raw power, his eagle form giving him less mobility than you would imagine, granting him powers over air, wind and storms. His lynx form highly enhanced his speed, and made him an even more discreet and cunning foe when hid in the wilderness. Lastly, his dragonhawk form gifted him with powerful fire spells, as well as regaining him the ability to fly. It should however be noted that while his transformation powers are extensive, they were gifted to him by the animal gods, and he didn't master them on his own. He is thus unlikely to develop anything more than what they gave him, not by himself at least. This one is a tough call, as Vol'jin is a far more trained caster than Zul'jin ever was, being mostly new to any form of magic. However, while Vol'jin is very capable and an orthodox shadow hunter, he is not exceptional, whereas Zul'jin mastered the boons of all four remaining gods without ever being trained in any spiritual art before in his life. His powers being enough to make him a powerhouse capable of fending off a small troop by himself, Zul'jin of the Amani wins the magical resources edge, despite Vol'jin's excessive training and strong bond with the lowers.
Faith is a powerful weapon.
So I'm told. The Alliance has the light from which to draw its strength. What steels this iron horde in its darkest hours?
The voodoo powers and chi training of Vol'jin, while being connected and close to Zul'jin's animal powers, make him a completely different spellcaster, focused more on subtle attacks to his opponent's mind and soul and personal spiritual and physical improvement. These two types of entities and energies not being at odds, the nature of Vol'jin's and Zul'jin's magical powers does nothing to make one of them gain an edge upon the other. No advantage can be obtained here for either of them.
You Pandaren tried to bury your hate and your anger, but such power cannot be contained. It must be unleashed!
As the chieftain of the Darkspear tribe and war chief of the Horde, Vol'jin is a very steady leader, capable of remaining calm and thinking clearly under any circumstances. Even on the brink of death, his mind is strong enough to keep striving, his connection with Bronze-Samedi leaving him unafraid of taking deadly risks. Able to remain diplomatic, compromising, and upon mining in an encounter, he is also capable to maim and kill his opponents without a shred of hesitation, once his mind is set and he knows it to be necessary to protect his people. Vol'jin is capable of accepting his own mistakes and changing to correct himself, as was demonstrated in Vol'jin, Shadows of the Horde, where he learned to become a stronger and wiser version of himself in Shadowbound Monastery, deeming his former self not able for the battles to come after being trapped by Garrosh's ploy. Vol'jin embodies the Darkspear philosophy of survival above all else, combined with a renewal of the belief system and traditional society after coming into contact with the Horde. Combining the serenity of the Chushulu philosophy and the ferocity and tenacity of a true warlord, Vol'jin's mind is free of doubt and perfectly set for any kind of battle. Zul'jin's entire life was dedicated to the defeat of his enemies, to the point that he had trouble even accepting an alliance with anyone other than fellow forest trolls. The Amani never give up, they never forget, and they never die. This is what he believes, taking this nationalism to a fanatical point, always believing, whatever happens, that he should keep attacking and planning and that eventually his tribe will triumph. Zul'jin thinks as if he was eternal, as if he could just go on fighting forever until victory comes, at his hands or in that of a future Amani war leader come to win instead. A violent inferiority complex toward the elves of Quel'Thalas, made only worse by the torture they inflicted upon him, makes him prefer death to giving up, and gives him particular hatred against any kind of elven or human foe. All in all, Zul'jin can be declared to be mad, unhinged, both weak psychologically and strong beyond reason and common sense as long as he follows his chosen path. While Vol'jin isn't as ferocious and hard-minded as Zul'jin, he has an extremely useful asset and a peaceful mind to rule over his inner strength. None of the trolls would have their minds falter against any kind of opponents. Both are able to die or kill without confusion or hesitation, but only Vol'jin is capable of thinking beyond himself and listening to reason, even while enraged. The lower than his monk training makes his mind extremely stable, while Zul'jin is completely unhinged, his obsession with revenge bringing him to the brink of madness, a very dangerous position to be into when facing a Shadowcaster. The psychological edge goes to Vol'jin of a Darkspear. Now that we reviewed every aspect of the combatants, let me share my view of how the duel to the death would go if Vol'jin and Zul'jin were to meet and come to blows. The fight would be likely to take place in a dense jungle, maybe in a troll temple dedicated to sacred duels between chieftains. Vol'jin would arrive on his raptor, carrying a bow, a spear, some knives and a glaive, as well as various blessings and masks on his armor. Zul'jin would most likely consider cheating and starting the duel by attacking by behind, but would not do so and face Vol'jin openly, mounted on an Amani warbear, with more respect toward ancient traditions than he has for his elf-befriending opponent. Even as he prepares for a fight to the death, Vol'jin would attempt a respectful salute, but Zul'jin would insult him, demeaning him for taking leadership of a faction who harbors blood elves that have a treaty with the Alliance, calling him less than a real troll. Vol'jin will not falter under the insult, his resolve to end the bloodshed by one last kill being only strengthened by Zul'jin's madness. The Amani chieftain would then run to the fight, wasting no more words, charging on his warbear, all the while observing his opponent carefully. Dashing to the side by expertly leading his raptor, Vol'jin would draw his bow and prepare to shoot his incoming adversary, but would be surprised by the proximity of a leaping Zul'jin, leaving his mount all ready to jump and stab his opponent. Vol'jin would be startled, but his quick reflexes would allow him to shift weaponry and pull out a spear in an attempt to impale Zul'jin on impact. The latter would not be so easily tricked, and would manage to grab onto the spear and push Vol'jin out of his saddle, though he'd have to renounce the killing blow he had hoped for. Both trolls would fall off to the ground, Zul'jin's bear being retrieved by Amani observers of the fight, and Vol'jin's raptor would stick around the fight, confused at what he should do to help his master. A deadly high-speed flurry of blades would ensue in the arena, none of the chieftains waiting to get back on their feet to start striking at each other. Zul'jin would attempt to get close and diminish Vol'jin's range of movement, but he would most likely fail as the Darkspear leader would make sure to use his spear to maintain his opponent away while attacking and compensating Zul'jin's superior speed with hefty blows of his glaive. Zul'jin would get angry, infuriated by his foe's refusal to make it a savage fight, and would start flinching, throwing axes upon his enemy as soon as he tried to take distance, harassing the Darkspear. Vol'jin, realizing his opponent's superiority in direct combat, would remain patient, kiting and parrying, all the while preparing to cast deadly hexes and shadow spells against the Amani chieftain. Startled by the furious pain and darkness enveloping his mind, Zul'jin's first reaction would be to step up his game and attack with all the speed he could muster. However, Zul'jin would not change his tactics, focusing half of his mind on his hexes and spells, and the other half to parry Zul'jin's blows with both his weapons and Shadowbound-trained agility, stopping his physical attacks altogether. The duel would be at lightning speed, their fast steps touching the ground only for fractions of a second, and eventually leaving the arena grounds, without caring where they would take the battle. Although Vol'jin would probably suffer some cuts, and the grievous throw might even wound him, but with the protection of the Loas and an excellent defense he would avoid any serious damage, while proving he could gravely attack Zul'jin's undefended mind. Quickly realizing his problem, Zul'jin would start relying on his powerful new friends, and assume the bare form of Nalorak, surprising and unexpected throw in order to crush Vol'jin's defense. The initial surprise would indeed repel the jungle troll away, who would quickly adapt and start running, unashamed, while forming a new strategy against this mysterious power. Pursued by Zul'jin, he would most likely find his raptor and hop back on it, in order to take his distances with Zul'jin's claws. The latter would not be fooled into thinking Vol'jin was giving up, and would keep up the chase, determined. Despite this, Vol'jin would start firing arrows at his bare opponent, as he had been trained to do against many preys during his hunts, and Zul'jin would have to adapt yet again, this time adopting his eagle form to counter the mystical powers of his shadow hunter enemy. Not knowing what to expect from this new, likely faster form, Vol'jin would keep shooting, and would be surprised to be assaulted by a powerful wind, hampering his movements and locking him in place to be struck by the lightning of Akel'Zon, the eagle god. Faced with great danger, Vol'jin will rely on Shan'gr, the Loa of Storms, to protect himself from the damage or at least reduce it, while stamping into the shadows to disappear from Zul'jin's sight and escape his wind power. Once the storm would dissipate, Zul'jin would realize he had not destroyed his enemy as he had hoped to do, and would be surprised by grievous shadow spells from Vol'jin, fleeing rapidly on his raptor while shooting a barrage of arrows. Having both succeeded to wound their opponent by surprising him, both warriors would retry the same strategy, but Vol'jin would now be careful to protect himself from Zul'jin's spell, while the Amani chieftain would know to keep moving, fleeing Vol'jin's arrows. His shadow spells would not be so easily avoided, however, and Zul'jin would know that. He would know he couldn't keep this up for long. Dashing to the ground, Zul'jin would assume the lynx form of Halazi, falling upon Vol'jin in a fast and deadly attack. By this time, however, Vol'jin would have understood Zul'jin's power to take on various animal forms, and would have been prepared to defend against basically anything. A lynx not being too far outside the realm of his experiences, Vol'jin wouldn't have too much trouble leaping out of his saddle to avoid the blow, but the sharp claws of Zul'jin would find his raptor instead, mortally wounding the beast, who would fall to the ground, roaring in pain, effectively depriving Vol'jin of his mount. Faced with one another again, Vol'jin would wish to avoid the return of Zul'jin's deadly eagle form, and start relying on his close combat skills so as not to leave him a chance to transform again. Once the battle would stop being about hunting and running, Vol'jin would have no trouble battling the lynx, whose running speed would not help in such a face-to-face battle. Vol'jin would harass his opponent with his glaive, Zul'jin's animal form not being able to match a well-armed troll in face-to-face combat. At this point, both warriors would be hurt, and Zul'jin already knows his normal form cannot defeat Vol'jin. He also knows that his lynx form is now losing, that Vol'jin can evade and shoot his bird form, and changing into an eagle in close combat is far too risky. Left with only one option, Zul'jin would summon the follower of Jan'alai, the Dragonhawk Loa, and change it to a mighty and flying form, prepared to end his enemy's life in a column of fire. Not able to expect such a drastic change at close range, Vol'jin would keep attacking, unsuspecting of his mistake, and slash the feeble Dragonhawk form while being struck with the full might of a fire blast, casting him away, burned and grievously hurt. At this point, Vol'jin would now be in a bad position, his weapons burned or scattered, and though Zul'jin would have suffered bloody wounds at his foe's hands, the Dragonhawk form would give him the power to risk it all and end it in one last strike. Both have fled the arena, leaving them in the wilderness, with the option to risk their death in this fight or retreat in hope of a better occasion. In Vol'jin's case, fleeing scarcely reduces his chances of dying, and he would miss the opportunity to take Zul'jin out. Zul'jin would have a better shot if he ran now, to carefully finish his prey, but fleeing in such conditions, now that he has the advantage against such a powerful and hated opponent, would be intolerable to the Amani chieftain, who would prefer risking his life to end his foes. Both combatants would deduce all this in a split second and resume their attack. Zul'jin would prepare his most powerful fire spell, wishing to utterly incinerate his enemy, while Vol'jin would dash at an unearthly speed to inflict a deadly chi strike that he knows Zul'jin cannot anticipate, since he lacks knowledge about the Pandaren monks. Vol'jin would end up leaping right through a column of fire, striking a completely open opponent with an explosive blow in a last blaze of glory. The dust and ash of the fight would finally settle, revealing the result of the fight. Both trolls laying upon each other, unmoving, Vol'jin having his entire body covered in burns and claw marks, and Zul'jin pierced by many arrows and cuts, a look of madness lingering in his eyes, while a gaping hole in his chest leaves no doubt concerning his fate. The trolls who had witnessed the beginning of the fight would eventually find them, believing them to have killed each other, but after a while, with the whispers of Aurore in his ear, Vol'jin would slowly rise up, showcasing his numerous scars and basking in the glory of his hard-earned victory. Determining the victor in a fight between Vol'jin and Zul'jin is quite hard due to the nature of their powers, who are both closely related and widely different. In the end, I believe you could argue that Zul'jin is really the most powerful one, and it is reflected in my depiction of the fight, since Zul'jin ends up having a chance to run away and secure Vol'jin's eventual demise, something that would surely be the end of Vol'jin. However, Zul'jin's war-minded persona prevents him from ever giving up the fight, and I believe that in such circumstances, he would succumb to the temptation to try and end his foe, being ultimately so persuaded of his superiority that he would think himself able to win and survive. Him not knowing of Vol'jin's monk training helped drive a nail into Zul'jin's coffin. In the end, the state of the mind and the respect of the spirits of Aurore is what made a big difference, allowing Vol'jin enough stamina and regeneration ability to barely survive Zul'jin's last stand, leaving him victorious over a technically superior opponent. The winner is Vol'jin of the Darkspear, War Chief of the Horde. Hey, thank you all for watching, and know that this is my very first video on YouTube ever. Don't hesitate to criticize me in the comments, anything is good to take, and I'll be happy to discuss this fight and what you have to say about it. You can ask any question you want in the comments, suggest any possible fight you'd like to see happening in my channel, and if you enjoy this type of video, Don't forget to like and subscribe in order to be updated on next versus videos. Next one will analyze a potential fight between Grommash Earlscream and his own son, Garrosh. Stay tuned if you want to see what happened. This is Ali from WoW Versus, signing out.